I thank the gentleman. Now recognize the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Bishop, for 5 minutes.
That does it. I sit up here and I wonder what you must be thinking who are here kind enough to spend your time watching us today. And you must be troubled that only one of the major parties is here. You must be discouraged as you ponder what it would take for the federal government to fix this problem. I appreciate your hospitality and your interest, and I love everything I've seen about Yuma. How many fentanyl deaths in Yuma this year, Supervisor Lyons, in the past year?
Mr. Bishop, I was just able to submit data that I acquired from the hospital. That number continues to increase. You know, the average nationwide is 1 in 100,000, and yet we've had 16 fatalities directly attributable to fentanyl, so more than 16 times the national average.
How many ODs?
16. Well, there were 117 overdoses, and 16 of those were
16
fatals.
deaths, right? So you're way above the national average in that key thing. You know, you made a point earlier that this is very interesting because a lot of our colleagues in Washington say over and over and over again that the uncontrolled immigration between ports of entry really doesn't contribute to the illicit drugs because they come through the ports of entry. You've touched on that already, and you've said your data that Border Patrol's furnished to you is that about half, I hope everybody's listening in Washington, about half of the seizures are occurring between ports of entry.
Yes, sir.
Means it is coming from this uncontrolled problem. And yet, you know, we have colleagues that Katie Porter said at a hearing, she's a Democrat from California, she said last week at a hearing, we had a change in president in 2020 and some changes in border policy. And what we can see here is that the facts show we are seizing a lot more fentanyl, and for me, as a mom, that is a sign of success. I don't even know what to say about that. Border Chief Raul Ortiz said a couple of weeks ago, put a tweet out that said that Yuma, so far in fiscal year 23, we have seized over 476 pounds of fentanyl between ports of entry along our southwest border. That's enough to kill 100 million people. I'd say that's a problem even that Washington should be able to recognize. I want to use my remaining time, Supervisor Lyons, I hope you won't be offended. I was taken with a moment of conversation between you and me at the lunch before we came in here. I hope you won't mind my sharing it with the committee and with those attending, because for me it connects to the issue that we're grappling with. You and your wife have 11 children, and with 3 remaining at home, your wife has undertaken developing subdivisions.
Yes, she has.
You have 4 grandchildren. Your children are hardworking and productive. And yet you've made time not only to serve in office, but as a charitable leader, particularly as a chairman of the food bank, not only reckon with the awesome task of figuring out how to provide for 11 children, but you've produced and served in a way to demonstrate just how constructive and productive human lives can be. And as extraordinary as your story is, I would say that, and I don't articulate it to single you out, but to recognize that the law enforcement officers who are sitting next to and behind you, and the healthcare professionals like Dr. Trenchell, and the men and women attending this, there are hundreds of lives who likewise have fulfilled and even exceeded their potential to contribute to building and sustaining a culture that has proved the most successful in the history of mankind for the flourishing of human beings. And everyone wants his family, his or her family and children to thrive. And I submit that what we're talking about is not really a question of the stresses on the safety net, the provision of food for the people who can't provide it for themselves, the provision of medical care, the jail, the detention services, keeping the community safe. This is about how we maintain and protect a culture that has been the most successful in the world. And that is what is at stake, too. So I'm grateful to you for having us here, for your hospitality in this great community, to show me that yet again, and to remind all of us that we must act. We must act. And the first thing we must do, I'm going to finish this way because I think everybody's got a responsibility to say, what are we going to do? Matt Gaetz summarized it correctly, that it is a question of will. And the first thing to preserve this culture we must do is we must restore order. And the best vehicle at hand, Chip Roy of Texas is not here today, can't be here today, but his H.R. 29, which says to the Secretary of Homeland Security, notwithstanding any other provision of law, with respect to every migrant that you encounter, you must detain or turn away. You cannot just release them into the country. You cannot continue doing this to all of our support services, our safety net on which our culture depends. You cannot do this to our culture, or we will surely face not only what you just, a shocking information you just mentioned, Supervisor Lyons, about the assassinations. I haven't heard that story, I'm afraid to say. But there was this, on January 5 of this year, in I think it's Calacua, Mexico, there was a war between the Sinaloa Cartel and the Mexican army, with helicopter gunships firing against people on the ground and burning cars, blocking the entrances to the town so that the people were cowered in their homes. And that will occur in the United States of America if we do not get control of this problem. It sits squarely as a responsibility of the federal government, and we must have the will to act. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Well done. Well done. Thank you.
Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized. Mr. Bishop.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield to the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Buck.
I just wanted to respond to Mr. Cohen and Mr. Bishop. I'd appreciate your input on this, but my understanding of the Declaration of Independence is that it talked about certain self-evident truths, and it is not talking about the speed limit that a legislature sets or some other laws that are enacted, but the three basic rights that we have, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, are, in the view of the founders and in my view, and I think in many other Americans' views, given to us by God. That doesn't mean that God makes a decision on every single law that is passed in this country. That doesn't mean that God doesn't frown sometimes when there are horrible, horrible historical, I don't want to call them mistakes because that really undermines the seriousness of it, but actions by human beings like slavery, like the denial of the right to vote, and some other things. But life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are recognized in our founding documents as given to us by God, and those rights are the rights that everything else flows from. And I yield back to the gentleman from North Carolina.
I thank you, Mr. Buck, and I really yielded to you, Mr. Buck, rather than speaking first, because it boggles the mind what was just expressed by my friend from Tennessee. Except what was said earlier here today that I think is apt, both by Mr. Roy and then also by you, Mr. Buck, I think, and Mr. Johnson. Well, Mr. Roy and Mr. Johnson, I think, who said that it just falls to the Republican Party to be the party that values human life and protects it. The other side doesn't. Well, we've just seen something else that epitomizes the Democratic Party of today. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Not to Mr. Cohen. Not to Mr. Cohen. He embraces that modern Democratic Party's view that it's not about God, it's not about God's will or what God has created in mankind. You cannot trace rights to the existence of God or the creation by God of all creation and humanity in His image. That's all passé. That's old party, that's old talk. That's archaic. Okay, that's what we're up against, just so Americans know. But just as for me, I'm absolutely certain that Thomas Jefferson and the other authors of the Declaration were correct. I'm certain that this country succeeds because of a beneficent and forgiving and caring God.
Mr. Biggs, will you yield for a question?
Look, I'd be defensive too.
I'm not defensive.
I would try to
I'm
intercede.
asking you a question.
I'm not going to yield.
Gentlemen,
I'm not going to yield. I'm not going to yield because I'm going to make this statement really clear so that even Democrats can get it. You do what you want to. You reject God if you want to. You tell Americans that if they embrace God, you're going to persecute them with the FBI if you want to.
Oh, God.
You go get them. Call them white supremacists, why don't you? Let's set everybody against one another as enemies based on whatever thing that you can dream up to do. You do that. I'm going to stick to God. I'm going to cling to God like Barack Obama talked about. You do it. You do you. Anybody else want to speak?
Yeah, I'd like to
I
speak.
yield to the gentleman from. Yeah,
How about clinging to the truth?
Quite enough.
How about
You've said a
clinging to the
mouthful.
truth?
I thank
for a
the gentleman
moment.
for yielding. I thank the gentleman for
You
yielding.
said a mouthful.
And
I yield to Mr. Johnson.
I apologize that I missed Mr. Cohen's speech. I was in the back in the meeting, but I want to say if he believes that rights derive from government, just be reminded that government can take those rights back from you, and that our rights do come from our Creator. And I want to point out too that the great civil rights leaders would have disagreed with what you just said, Mr. Cohen, because Martin Luther King Jr. said in his famous speech on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, the Declaration, and he often said the Declaration of Independence was a promissory note to future generations of Americans. It wasn't realized in the beginning, but we're in the process of making a more perfect union, and that's what we're for, that's what we support. Thank you, Mr. Bishop, for yielding. We're out of time. Thank you. The chair recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Bishop.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Johnson, I'm interested in pursuing that a little bit. The chairman titled this hearing, Free Speech, the Biden Administration's Chilling of Parents' Fundamental Rights. And of course, talking about the Attorney General's memo, folks on the other side of the aisle have been interested in talking about what you describe as book bans and educational gag orders. I just wonder, and of course you're free to put anything you want to in your testimony, but did you consider that the subject, the Attorney General's memo, well, let me ask you this way, did PEN America condemn the Attorney General's memo?
We did not put out a statement during the time of the memo, no, sir.
So, and you've said, you were very carefully, and you're a lawyer, a First Amendment lawyer, and you know this stuff. You laid out earlier what the First Amendment doesn't protect if there's actual and incitement of imminent violence.
Yes, sir.
And so is it a matter of concern to you whether the Attorney General of the United States, the highest law enforcement officer, issued a memorandum for action in every judicial district in the country concerning activism relating to school boards? I mean, it matters a great deal, doesn't it? Whether there was a sufficient factual predicate of actual threats or incitement of violence as opposed to that even rambunctious advocacy that you made reference to.
I think it's critically important that people have a right to speak out, and I do believe that. We would oppose efforts to restrict protected speech, absolutely.
So why do you deem that subject unworthy of comment?
I can't speak to what.
Did you engage in a wide gamut of free expression issues is what your testimony says. That's what you do. And here the highest law enforcement officer in the country did something that can only be described as chilling. And what it appeared to me when I went through every footnote in that NSAB letter that the Attorney General relied upon, I couldn't find. There were like maybe 2 across the country acts involving busting a door in one case. I didn't find, and a lot of these responses coming back from United States attorneys and all these meetings that they summoned said there weren't any. Then the local officers, when they got in touch with them, said, you guys are doing something you have no business doing. Is that not a matter of concern to you as an advocate for free expression?
I appreciate the question, sir, and I'm happy to go back and look at it. I cannot tell you at this moment why.
So for whatever reason, it didn't arise to a level of significance for you. Not enough to talk about in your testimony anyway, right?
No, sir, I wouldn't put it that way. I would put it in the way that we are really focused on ensuring that people do have the right to access, and we have been focused, as you know, and as my testimony reflects, about this wave of censorship that's happening at the state and local level. It does not mean we don't care, sir.
All right.
But
How
I
about
appreciate
this
the question.
Have you read the Twitter files?
I'm sorry?
Have you read the Twitter files? Not familiar with that? You know about Matt Taibbi and Michael Schellenberger
yes,
and the
yes,
others?
okay, I'm sorry.
They've issued 19, they describe the use of the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, the Cyber Infrastructure and Security Agency, the Global Engagement Center at the State Department, the ODNI, the CIA, to act directly with social media platforms and through private so-called disinformation researchers. I noticed on PEN America's website, you guys talk a lot about reacting to disinformation. On the pretext of reacting to disinformation, they got with social media companies, they took down millions of social media posts. And then they used things like Hamilton 68 that purported to tie them to Russia. It was all BS. Is that not a matter of concern to you?
Sir, I can go back and take a look at what we've actually done.
I mean, that's extraordinary. That's what I'm saying. So, and I think what's interesting in this, where we are in this, the subcommittee on weaponization, which is not this committee, is that you took pains to say that your organization, it doesn't care about which side of the aisle it's on, that the free expression ought to be of concern to everybody. We're talking about, as one witness called it, the largest censorship exercise in the history of the United States government. And that wasn't the subject that you chose to talk about either. Are you a partisan, or are you just interested in free expression on, across the political spectrum?
Sir, we are a nonpartisan organization, and we have engaged in a lot of defense of people from both sides of the aisle, from our campus free speech to looking at protest rights. We are definitely engaged on this from a nonpartisan perspective. I do appreciate the question. I'm more than happy to take a look and respond for the record, but at this point, I just don't have the response on those particular, on the Twitter files right now.
I hope we can all get together, because I think they're really important issues, and they don't matter what your party is, and I hope we'll cover a lot of ground on those subjects. Mr. Chairman, my time's expired.
Thank you. Chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr.
Mr. Durham, I've got a number of things I want to ask you, but do you desire to address what was being raised just now in fairness?
Yeah, apparently Mr. Schiff's questions are from an unsourced New York Times article written by Charlie Savage. I don't believe that there's anything in that article that is attributed to Ms. Danahy. And my recollection, I could be mistaken, but my recollection is that Ms. Danahy did not comment, wasn't quoted in any way in that article. So to the extent that the New York Times wrote an article suggesting certain things, it is what it is.
Right. All right. Was Danchenko's status as a paid informant, a confidential human source, concealed from you for any period of time?
I'm not sure that was concealed. We found that out. We were once.
When did you learn about it?
When we started the investigation and how long it took for the FBI to identify this principal subsource and why the principal subsource wasn't identified earlier. That's when we came across Danchenko. We then asked the Bureau for, we found out he was a confidential human source. We asked the Bureau for his informant file, and that's when we gleaned that information.
Okay, so it was from his informant file once you got that from the FBI. Was there any delay in furnishing that to you?
Not that I recall, no.
Do you have any recollection? You were investigating, you said, from May 2019. He was a CHS until October 2020.
Yes.
You know when in that period of time, roughly, you learned that he was a CHS?
Probably halfway through there, but I'm not certain.
Okay. Why didn't you interview him while he was a paid source for the FBI?
Let me see. So with respect to Mr. Danchenko, he was interviewed by the Bureau in January 2017. We had brought to the attention of the new administration and the FBI, Mr. Danchenko's circumstances, including the prior espionage case that they never resolved or addressed.
Right. I understand all those details. I'm asking why you didn't interview him.
So when we were dealing with that section, Mr. Danchenko was represented by counsel. Mr. Danchenko, as you may know in the normal course, you have to advise people whether they're subjects or targets of investigations, and we did not arrive at a point where we could interview Mr. Danchenko.
The FBI made Danchenko a CHS on March 7, 2017, after the factual predicate for Crossfire Hurricane in the Steele dossier had collapsed in January 2017 in his interview because he could not corroborate the dossier, and he revealed to the FBI that he was not a Russian-based source, nor did he have a high-level network of sources. The next day, March 8, the FBI finalized talking points drafted by Lisa Page on direction of Andrew McCabe for use in briefing the Gang of Eight in Congress. And Congress was briefed prior to Director Comey's testimony on March 20. Now, Attorney General Barr told the nation in December 2019 that you were examining the continuation of the investigation beyond the January collapse of the supposed factual basis and looking at irregularities, misstatements, and omissions. Yet your report makes no mention of the March 8 talking points prepared for Congress. Why?
I mean, aware that there were talking points because it just wasn't part of the crux, the central portion of what we were reporting on.
I want the clerk to put up on the screen what is my submittal mark number 7 while I'm asking you this question. These talking points emerged into public as a defense exhibit in the Sussman case. They contained lurid allegations about Manafort operating high-level contacts with the Kremlin through Carter Page, that Steele had a primary subsource who was Russian-based, and that the primary subsource had a network of high-level Republican subsources. Same garbage that Danchenko had debunked in his January interview. These talking points were circulated among senior FBI leaders and Department of Justice leaders, more than a dozen passed on them. Did you interview them all about how this could occur or consider this material as the basis of prosecutable offenses?
We identified and interviewed many people in the FBI. I guess I would have to know who this particular email was circulated to be able to tell you whether we interviewed each of those persons or not.
Last point, I guess, because I'm about out of time. You identify the failure of the FBI to interview Dolan as sort of inexplicable. Totally agree. But as I go through your report and look, there are people who declined to be interviewed, not only Dolan, Danchenko, McComey, McCabe, Priestap, Strzok, Page, Glenn Simpson, among others. Seems inexplicable to me that you didn't compel their testimony. Can you explain that at all?
First, let me make it clear that it is as disappointing, perhaps more disappointing to me and my colleagues that these people would not agree to be interviewed. You know, some of them had a lot to say publicly, but they refused to be interviewed by our folks. Let me explain. I'm not going to speak to any particular person because I don't want to violate any rules, but let me give you the general kinds of considerations that go into these things. First of all, the only way in which you can compel, as it were, a person's testimony would be to get a court order after somebody has asserted the Fifth Amendment privilege. So one factor, there are multiple factors I'll go through here, but one factor is that a grand jury subpoena doesn't give a federal prosecutor the authority to simply force people to talk about things that the prosecutor, or in this instance, the investigative reviewers, might be interested in. In order to properly use a grand jury subpoena, you need to have an active grand jury investigation that's ongoing and a reasonable belief to believe that the person that you want to have come in has relevant information about that information. Otherwise, you run up against claims of grand jury abuse or claims of trying to set a perjury trap or other bad faith reasons. So you can't just subpoena people to make them talk. You can subpoena people when you believe that they have relevant information. So that's a factor. We also take into consideration if a person has previously refused to cooperate, they won't cooperate with you on matters, even matters that they've previously talked about. And on prior occasions, those people have repeatedly said, I don't recall, I don't remember, and so forth and so on. You have to make this sort of prudential judgment. Well, okay, if you were to subpoena a person because you can make an argument that they have information that might be relevant to the investigation, is it going to be worth the effort to have them come in and then repeatedly say, I don't recall, I don't recall? You look at the most sensitive piece of information that you all saw in the classified information, right? That source. Mr. Comey was asked about that in a congressional hearing under oath, and he didn't recall it.
Understood.
So you make the decision, okay, are we likely to get something or not?
Mr. Chair.
Yep.
We over?
Yep.
All right.
I will yield the balance of my time to the gentleman from North Carolina.
I thank the gentlewoman. And Mr. Mayorkas, you've spoken a lot about lawful pathways you've created, and I think you rely on your parole authority to do that. Is that right?
That is one of the methods, yes, Congressman.
What other method besides parole? What other source of authority besides parole?
That is the primary
Well,
method.
I know.
No,
But what's the other one, then, if it's the primary one?
well, refugee processing is a lawful pathway.
Okay, and that's established by statute, the refugee
Yes,
program.
and the parole authority is also codified in statute. It's a discretionary.
Right, so here's what it says. It says, Attorney General may, in his discretion, parole into the United States temporarily under such conditions as he may prescribe only on a case-by-case basis for urgent humanitarian reasons or significant public benefit any alien applying for admission to the United States. And you've spoken today, it was interesting to me, what attracted my attention. You spoke about case-by-case being an individual determination. What is the source of authority that allows you to define categories or classes to then operate, to bring people in and then look at them case-by-case?
Congressman, as I've stated, we exercise that parole authority on a case-by-case basis.
But you define these categories or classes. What allows you to do that? What authority do you rely upon?
That defines the perimeter of individuals who may become eligible for the case-by-case adjudications.
Seems in tension to me. I yield.
Yeah, good point. Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, let me focus on CISA a moment and something very specific. Jen Easterly, the director of CISA, testifying before an appropriations subcommittee here in the House earlier this year, said, quote, "We don't flag anything to social media organizations at all. We are focused on building resilience to foreign influence and disinformation," close quote. Is that true or false, that CISA does not flag anything to social media organizations at all?
I believe that is true, Congressman, and I will verify that, but I believe that is true. We do.
Do you know, are you familiar with Brian Scully? Do you know who that is?
I do not, Congressman.
He was, I think, the MDM, the person responsible for MDM, as you call it. And he testified about switchboarding, that CISA was engaged in switchboarding in which, for example, it was essentially an audit official to identify something on social media that they deemed to be disinformation aimed at their jurisdiction. They could forward that to CISA, and CISA would share that with the appropriate social media companies. Now, that was a quote from his testimony. That sounds like flagging to me, flagging to social media companies, and all of his testimony was of similar import. How does that reconcile with what you just said Ms. Easterly correctly answered before the Appropriations Subcommittee?
Congressman, a few points on switchboarding.
No. Would you
Yes.
Would you reconcile those two statements, please?
Yes.
I don't really have enough time to go off on a dissertation.
Yes, I will,
Okay,
if you'll allow me.
quickly, thank you.
That practice, my understanding is that practice was in 2018 and 2020, is no longer employed by CISA, and what it amounted to was serving as an intermediary between election officials and social media companies. We were not making a judgment back then in 2018 or 2020.
I get your point. And I know you're going to want to elaborate, and I appreciate that. But I think the point you just said, and I'd like to inquire further about it, you said it's no longer the practice. When did it stop?
I'd be pleased to provide that information to you, and I will defer to the Director Easterly, but we will provide that information to you.
You do not know when they stopped doing it?
I do not.
You have said in your testimony here today several times that we are taking it to the cartels to an unprecedented degree, dismantling those criminal organizations. Those are two things you said. Have Mexican drug cartels become stronger or weaker during your tenure as Secretary?
Congressman, we are taking it to the cartels to an unprecedented
You already said that. In
degree.
fact, I just repeated it to you. Have they become stronger or weaker on your watch?
Congressman, the cartels have been a challenge for not only this country, but many
Are
countries
you not able
around
to
the
say
world.
whether they're stronger or weaker on your watch?
We, through our efforts have weakened those cartels by the investigations and prosecutions that we have conducted with our international
The cartels
partners.
are weakened under your tenure?
When
Is that what
we-
your testimony is, sir?
When we disrupt a cartel, when we arrest an individual with our partners, we have weakened them. That is what the men and women of the Department of Homeland Security are dedicated to doing.
How much revenue have the cartels received during your tenure?
Congressman, I don't have that data.
Do you have any, you have no estimate about that whatsoever? That
The
you bear in
cartels-
your mind what revenues Mexican drug cartels have received during your tenure as secretary?
Congressman, the cartels are very profitable. They were very profitable 3 years ago, and they were very profitable 6 years ago.
Are they
And I
making
will tell you
more
this,
or less revenue under your tenure now than under previous administration?
and I will tell you this, that we are unrelenting in our
More or,
attack
I
against the
understand your
cartels.
efforts, sir. What I'm talking about are your results. Are they making more or less revenue under your tenure than your predecessors?
We have arrested more criminals involved in cartel activity than in the prior
Do you not
several
know
years.
whether they're making more revenue, or are you simply evading my question?
Congressman, I believe I answered your question that I do not have that data.
Are
And I
drug
will say
deaths
this,
due to penetrating the southern border of the United States increased or reduced during your 30-month tenure over prior periods?
the cartels outside of the United States have also stretched their jurisdiction to other countries around the world.
How does your record on achieving operational control compare to other administrations? Worse than any other?
No, Congressman, the approach that we are taking, expanding lawful pathways.
You've had
and
larger
delivering-
numbers of entries in violation of that
Time of the gentleman.
statutory
Time of the gentleman.
definition, have you not, sir?
Congressman, the approach that we are taking of expanding lawful pathways and delivering consequences for those who do not use them are proving results. It continues to be a challenge, as the border has been in the absence of legislative action, but we are achieving results.
I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina.
Mr. Attorney General, you're the only person who could ensure that Mr. Weiss had all the necessary authority, aren't you?
I'm the only person who can sign an agreement with respect to special counsel. The authority to do Section 515 can be signed by other people in the department.
You're aware, ultimately, though, the authority is yours.
Yes,
You
sir.
made the point that you don't take orders from the president about such things. You decide, ultimately, what the Justice Department will do.
I announced at the beginning, I promised that he would be able to bring whatever cases he wants, and I have followed through on that promise. I'm permitted to make that kind of promise, and I have made it.
Did you undertake to inform yourself, to interact with him sufficient to ensure that he knew he possessed that authority, or that you would see to it that he had all necessary
I don't
authority?
think there's any doubt that he knew. He has written 3 letters to this committee indicating that he understood he had that authority.
You're also aware, though, aren't you, sir, that a senior IRS investigator, whistleblower, came forward and has testified publicly that Mr. Weiss stated that he did not have such authority. He was not the decider. Are you aware of that?
I'm aware of the testimony. I was not present at any point during that statement. And
Have
Mr.
you
Weiss Mr. Weiss, who was present, has indicated that he had the authority and he knew that he had it.
Subsequent to those developments, though, you decided to make Mr. Weiss special counsel, which you had not done before.
Mr. Weiss made clear he did not ask me to be special counsel until last month, and last month I made him special counsel.
Did you have some lack of information that you should have had that would have caused you to act earlier to make him special counsel?
Mr. Weiss did not ask to be special counsel before.
I understand he didn't ask. You've said that, sir. Did you take the necessary steps to inform yourself what authority he understood he had or what obstacles he was encountering?
Look, Mr. Weiss had, as I said from the beginning, at the very beginning, that he had authority over all matters that pertain to Hunter Biden.
Have you learned that he was in fact deterred by decisions of the United States attorneys in the District of Columbia and the Northern District of California from proceeding as he thought best?
With respect, Congressman, Mr. Weiss has not said that he was deterred. He said that he followed the normal processes of the department. and that he was never denied the ability to bring a case in another jurisdiction.
Well, what changed then, Mr. Attorney General? What made you decide that it was sufficient to leave him in the situation he was until you decided to make him special counsel?
Mr. Weiss asked for that authority, given the extraordinary circumstances of this matter, and given my promise that I would give him any resources he requested, I made him special counsel.
So until that time, was it just a matter of his predilection, or did you undertake to investigate and discern what he was doing with his authority and whether he had faced any obstacles?
I did not endeavor to investigate because I had promised that I would not interfere with this investigation. The way to not interfere is to not investigate an investigation.
Once he requested to be named special counsel, having not done so over months and months of your tenure, did you ask him what had changed that made him now need to be a special counsel?
Mr. Weiss asked to be made special counsel. I had promised that I would give him all the resources he needed, and I made him special counsel.
When did the Justice Department permit statutes of limitations to expire on some of the prospective charges against Hunter Biden for tax violations?
I don't know anything about the statute of limitations here. The investigation was in the hands of Mr. Weiss to make the determinations that he thought were appropriate.
Are you unaware that statutes of limitations have in fact been allowed to expire after there having been tolling agreements in place?
I'm going to say again, the determination of where to bring cases and which kinds of cases to bring was left to Mr. Weiss.
Yes, sir. I understand that you've said that. That's part of the problem. The question is, are you aware that statutes of limitations have been allowed to expire while the matter was under investigation?
The investigators were fully familiar with all the relevant law.
I'm not asking for the excuses. I'm asking whether you're aware of that fact, sir.
I'm going to say again. I'm going to say again and again if necessary. I did not interfere with, did not investigate, did not make determinations.
Those are statements in response to other questions. Everybody in the country now knows who's paying attention to this, that the Justice Department permitted statutes of limitations to expire. Every lawyer who's ever practiced understands the implications of allowing statutes of limitations to expire. Do you not even know as you sit here whether that occurred or not?
Prosecutors make appropriate determinations on their own. In this case, I left it to Mr. Weiss whether to bring charges or not. That would include whether to let statute of limitations expire or not, whether there was sufficient evidence to bring a case that was subject to the statute of limitations or not, whether there were better cases to bring or not.
Time of the gentleman has expired.